Hank Connors had been a police officer for over 15 years in a small, quiet town. On the surface, he seemed like a dedicated law enforcement officer, always patrolling the streets and greeting people with a nod. But if you looked a little closer, the truth was far less noble. Behind the badge, Hank had a reputation, a troubling one. Whispers about his behavior spread through the community. Some said he used his position to get what he wanted, bending the rules to suit himself. Small business owners often felt nervous when he walked into their shops. Protection fees, as he called them, weren't optional. If anyone dared to say no, they would suddenly find themselves dealing with surprise inspections, fines, or worse. Most people didn't speak out. They didn't want trouble. Hank had a way of making people feel small. He'd look at them with a hard, judging stare, as if he was untouchable. And in a way he was. For years, no one challenged him. Complaints against him were dismissed or buried, and the police department never investigated his actions seriously. The people who dared to stand up against him found their voices drowned out by fear or disbelief. To most of his superiors, Hank was just a tough officer doing his job. But for many in the town, Hank's actions weren't just tough. They were unfair. Small incidents piled up over the years, creating a pattern. A young shopkeeper spoke about how her business was unfairly fined after she refused to pay Hank's fees. A driver recalled being ticketed repeatedly for no reason after a minor disagreement with him. The stories varied, but one thing was clear. Hank's behavior wasn't about keeping the town safe. It was about power. Still, Hank walked around like he owned the town. His confidence came from knowing the system had his back. He believed no one could stop him. That belief made him bold and careless, and he started making mistakes. Unbeknownst to him, a storm was brewing. Someone had noticed Hank's behavior, someone who wasn't afraid of him. The town had caught the attention of a larger force, and soon, Hank's unchecked actions would come under a scrutiny he wasn't prepared for. The first crack in Hank's seemingly unbreakable armor came with the arrival of Alex Ramirez. Ramirez, a stranger in town, seemed to blend into the background like any other newcomer. But Alex wasn't just anyone. He was there for a reason. Hank didn't know it yet, but his days of bending the rules and pushing people around were coming to an end. Hank thought he was untouchable, but his confidence would soon become his downfall. The small town rarely saw new faces, so when Alex Ramirez arrived, people noticed. He was polite, soft-spoken, and didn't attract much attention. To the locals, he looked like just another person starting fresh. Alex had rented a modest apartment above a bakery and quickly settled into the town's rhythm. He greeted people warmly, shopped at the local stores, and even chatted with the elderly folks who loved to sit outside the cafe and share stories. But Alex wasn't just any newcomer. He was an undercover FBI agent sent to investigate complaints of corruption within the police department, complaints that all seemed to point to one man, Officer Hank Connors. Over the past few years, reports had trickled in from the town about strange fines, missing money, and people being unfairly targeted. While the local authorities ignored these claims, higher-ups began to take notice. Alex's mission was simple but risky. He needed to gather enough evidence to prove that Hank was abusing his position. The challenge? Hank was known to be sharp, and getting too close too soon could blow the entire operation. So Alex decided to play the long game, blending into the community and observing Hank from the shadows. As the days passed, Alex started visiting local businesses, pretending to be a struggling entrepreneur. He spent time at the grocery store, the mechanic's shop, and even the diner where many officers, including Hank, liked to hang out. He asked harmless questions and listened carefully to people's complaints. The stories he heard confirmed his suspicions. Hank wasn't just tough. He was intimidating people into giving him money or favors. One day, Alex made a point to be at the local diner when Hank walked in. Hank was tall, confident, and loud, his very presence commanding attention. Alex watched as Hank greeted some people warmly but ignored others entirely, as if deciding who was worthy of his time. Alex also noticed how the diner owner tensed up when Hank spoke to him. There was something unnatural in their interaction, something that hinted at fear. Hank eventually spotted Alex sitting at a corner table and approached him. "You're new around here," Hank said, narrowing his eyes. "What brings you to town?" Alex smiled politely. "Just looking to start a small business," he replied, keeping his tone light. "Seems like a nice place." Hank studied him for a moment, his gaze sharp. "You'll want to make sure you're on the right side of things around here. Stick to the rules, and you'll be fine." The message was clear. Hank was marking his territory. Alex nodded, playing along, but inside, he knew this was only the beginning. Hank's confidence in his control over the town was glaringly obvious. What Hank didn't realize, however, was that his behavior had already started to dig his own grave. Alex left the diner that day knowing he was on the right track. Now, all he needed was to wait for Hank to slip. It didn't take long for Hank Connors to notice Alex Ramirez. In a small town where everyone knew everyone, a new face didn't stay unnoticed for long. Hank was used to being the one who ran the show, and anyone unfamiliar who came to town was automatically seen as a potential threat or opportunity. One afternoon, as Alex was walking out of a local store, Hank pulled his patrol car up next to him. The engine hummed loudly, and Hank rolled down his window, giving Alex a stern look. "You're the new guy, right?" Hank asked, his voice low but firm. Alex, maintaining his calm, nodded politely. "Yes, I'm just getting settled in. I'm planning to open a small business in town." Hank's eyes narrowed slightly. "A business, huh? You know, around here, it's best to get along with the right people." His tone was more of a warning than a casual remark. Alex smiled and gave a slight nod. "I understand. I'm just here to make a living, like anyone else." Hank studied Alex for a few seconds, clearly sizing him up. After a moment, he waved his hand dismissively and put the car in gear. "Well, just remember, if you need anything, you know where to find me." With that, Hank sped off, leaving Alex standing there with a feeling of unease settling in his stomach. It was clear that Hank wasn't the type to simply let things slide. Alex had been warned by a man who was, in his eyes, used to controlling everything and everyone around him. The encounter seemed innocent enough, but Alex knew it was just the beginning. Hank's statement was more than just a friendly piece of advice. It was a power play, a subtle hint that Hank saw everyone as someone who could either be in his corner or be under his control. Alex didn't take the warning lightly. He knew Hank's reputation, and he knew that the officer wouldn't hesitate to push people around if he thought they were weak or vulnerable. As the days went by, Alex continued his investigation, trying to blend in and keep a low profile. But Hank's presence in the town was undeniable. Everywhere Alex went, he could feel the weight of Hank's watchful eyes. He couldn't help but wonder how many others had felt this same pressure, the same subtle threat of intimidation that Hank seemed to carry with him like a shadow. One evening, while Alex was having dinner at a local diner, he noticed Hank sitting at the counter with a group of people. He couldn't hear the conversation, but the way Hank was talking with the others, so easily, so authoritatively, made it clear that he had the power to influence anyone around him. It was both impressive and unsettling. Alex knew that in order to take Hank down, he would need to be smart. He had to keep his cool, blend in even more, and wait for the right moment to act. But as he sat there quietly, watching Hank from across the room, Alex could feel the tension building inside him. This was a man who would stop at nothing to keep his hold on the town, and Alex was determined to make sure that wouldn't happen any longer. Over the next few weeks, Alex Ramirez continued to keep his distance, but it was clear that Hank Connors was becoming more curious about him. The tension between them was building. Hank was used to getting his way, but Alex wasn't going to let that happen. Alex knew that Hank's reputation wasn't just based on rumors. He was truly abusing his power, and it was time to catch him in the act. One afternoon, Alex was working on a project when he received an unexpected call. It was a local business owner, a man named Tom, who had been one of the few brave enough to speak out against Hank's actions. Tom had his own small shop in town, and Hank had visited him several times, demanding money for protection, in exchange for keeping the shop safe from trouble. Tom had been intimidated at first, but he finally decided to stand up for himself and go to the authorities. "I can't take it anymore, Alex," Tom said nervously over the phone. "He's coming back tomorrow. He's going to ask for money again, and I'm not sure what to do. I need your help." Alex's heart raced. This was the moment he had been waiting for. This was the evidence he needed to take Hank down once and for all. "I'll be there," Alex replied, trying to keep his voice calm. "Just stick to your story and don't give him anything." Alex hung up the phone, his mind racing. He quickly made his way to Tom's shop, preparing for the confrontation. When he arrived, Tom was pacing nervously, his face pale with worry. "He's on his way," Tom said, his voice trembling. They didn't have much time. Alex carefully positioned himself in a corner of the shop where he could remain hidden but still see what was happening. Tom went to the counter, trying to act natural, though it was obvious he was on edge. Alex felt his own pulse quicken. This was it. Minutes later, Hank walked in, his boots making a loud thud against the floor. He looked around the shop, his eyes scanning the shelves before locking onto Tom. Well, what do we have here?" Hank said, his voice dripping with authority. "You still haven't paid up, have you?" Tom hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I'm not giving you anything this time, Hank. I've had enough of your threats." Hank stepped closer to the counter, his face hardening. "You think you can get away with this?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I can make things difficult for you. Real difficult." Tom stood his ground, but it was clear he was scared. "I don't care anymore. You've been taking advantage of me for too long. I'm not paying you another cent." Alex could see Hank's anger rise. He had heard enough. He quietly activated his hidden recording device, making sure it captured every word. He had to make sure he had the evidence for when the time came. Hank wasn't backing down. He stepped even closer, now just a few feet away from Tom, his hands balled into fists. "You'll regret this," Hank muttered. "You'll regret not paying me. You'll regret everything." The words hung in the air, thick with menace. Alex stayed hidden in the corner, heart pounding, knowing this was the perfect opportunity to expose Hank's extortion once and for all. But then, Hank did something unexpected. He reached into his jacket, and for a brief moment, Alex thought he was pulling out a weapon. Instead, Hank withdrew a small stack of papers, likely more threats disguised as official documents. Alex took a deep breath. He knew Hank's bluffing wasn't going to last forever. He had the evidence, and it was time to make sure Hank couldn't get away with it any longer. With the evidence in hand, Alex Ramirez knew it was time to act. The past few weeks of careful observation and undercover work had led him to this moment. Hank Connors had made his threats clear, and now Alex had the proof he needed to bring him down. But the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. The operation to expose Hank would be risky, and there were a lot of moving parts. It had to be perfect. Alex contacted his team at the FBI. They were ready for the next step. The plan was simple. They needed to set up a meeting between Hank and Tom, with Alex present as a witness, to finalize the deal Hank was trying to force. They would record the entire interaction, making sure every word was captured and used as evidence in court. But there was a catch. Hank was known to be unpredictable. If he got suspicious or violent, everything could fall apart. Alex and his team decided to use a controlled environment for the meeting, a quiet, out-of-the-way location where they could keep watch without drawing attention. The local warehouse on the edge of town, often used for storage, seemed like the perfect place. It was isolated enough for Hank to feel comfortable, but close enough for the FBI to monitor. The plan was set. Tom would meet Hank and pretend he was finally going to pay the money he had been demanded. Alex would remain hidden in the shadows, recording everything, while the rest of the FBI team kept their distance, waiting for the signal to move in. The night of the operation, Alex's nerves were on edge. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this one felt different. Hank Connors wasn't just a regular criminal. He was someone with power, someone who believed he could do anything without consequence. Alex couldn't afford any mistakes. He had to stay focused. Tom arrived at the warehouse first. He was visibly nervous, but he had agreed to take part in the operation, knowing it was the only way to stop Hank's control over him and others in town. As soon as he entered the building, Alex followed behind, staying low and blending into the shadows. Not long after, Hank showed up, his usual confident stride betraying nothing of the tension in the air. He walked into the warehouse, glancing around before spotting Tom. The two exchanged a brief, tense greeting. "You sure you want to go through with this?" Hank asked, his voice cold. "You know I don't make deals like this. You pay me or I make your life even harder." Tom nodded, trying to keep his composure. "I'm paying you all right, but this is the last time. After this, I'm done." Hank grinned, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "We'll see about that." Alex was positioned just a few feet away, his camera rolling. He knew that every word, every action, was being recorded, and it would be enough to put Hank away. But as the conversation continued, Alex could feel the tension building. Hank's arrogance was on full display, and Alex knew it was just a matter of time before he would make his move. Suddenly, Hank reached into his jacket again, as if he were about to pull out something more than just a piece of paper. Alex's heart raced, but he stayed hidden, his hand tightening around the camera. This was the moment. Everything hinged on what happened next. The tension in the warehouse was thick. Alex watched, holding his breath as Hank reached into his jacket, his fingers curling around something unseen. For a moment, Alex's heart pounded in his chest, unsure of what Hank might do next. But then, Hank slowly pulled out a small stack of papers. It wasn't a weapon, but something even more dangerous, a document that seemed to reinforce his demands. "I think you're making a big mistake, Tom," Hank said, his voice cold and menacing. "You don't pay me, and things won't be so easy for you." Tom stood his ground, but it was clear from the way he shifted his weight that he was still nervous. He had never seen Hank so confident, so sure of himself. "This is the last time," Tom said, his voice shaky but firm. "I'm done with this. No more threats." Alex's mind raced, but he knew the time had come. He pressed a button on his hidden device, ensuring everything was recorded. Every word, every movement needed to be on record. He was moments away from signaling the team. Just as Hank took a step forward, ready to push Tom further, the door to the warehouse creaked open. Hank's head snapped around in surprise. The FBI agents burst into the room, their presence overwhelming. Hank froze, his eyes wide with shock. "FBI. Hands where we can see them," shouted one of the agents, his voice commanding. Hank's eyes darted from side to side, trying to process what was happening. His chest heaved with sudden panic as he realized that the situation had turned against him. Alex stepped out from his hiding spot, his heart still racing but now focused. Hank's arrogance had finally met its match. The evidence was irrefutable. Alex kept his camera steady as the agents moved in to secure Hank. "Hank Connors, you're under arrest for extortion, bribery, and abuse of power," one of the agents said, reading him his rights. Hank's face twisted with anger. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was caught, and there was nothing he could do to escape. The power he had wielded for so long was slipping away in an instant. For the first time in years, Hank was no longer in control. Tom let out a long breath, a mix of relief and exhaustion washing over him. He had feared this moment for so long, but now it was over. The weight of Hank's threats, the fear of retaliation, had been lifted from his shoulders. As the FBI agents took Hank away in handcuffs, Alex could see a flicker of hope in Tom's eyes. "This is it, Tom," Alex said quietly, walking over to him. "It's finally over." Tom nodded, though his face was still pale. "I never thought I'd see the day." The agents made sure to take all the necessary evidence from the scene, including the recordings of Hank's threats. Everything was in place for the trial. Hank Connors had finally been exposed for his years of abuse, and there was no turning back. As Hank was escorted out of the warehouse, Alex watched him with a quiet satisfaction. He had done what many thought impossible. He had brought down a man who thought he was untouchable. But more than that, he had helped the town reclaim its peace and dignity. It wasn't over yet. The legal battle would take time, but Alex knew that the truth would come out. Hank's reign of fear had ended, and the town could finally begin to heal. The courtroom was quiet as the judge entered, and the sound of his gavel striking echoed in the room. Hank Connors, once a powerful figure in the small town, now sat in a stiff chair in the defendant's section. His face was a mixture of anger and disbelief. This wasn't the way things were supposed to go. For years, he had ruled with an iron fist, getting away with whatever he wanted. But now he was facing charges that could change everything. Alex Ramirez sat in the gallery, his hands resting on his lap as he watched the trial unfold. He had done everything right, gathered the evidence, recorded the conversations, and helped expose the corruption. But this was the moment of truth. Now, it was up to the jury to decide Hank's fate. Would justice prevail, or would Hank manage to wiggle his way out once again? The prosecution began, presenting the evidence piece by piece. They showed the recordings of Hank threatening local business owners, demanding money in exchange for protection, and using his badge to intimidate people. The courtroom was silent as the jury listened closely to the damning evidence. It was clear that Hank's actions weren't just unethical, they were illegal. The recordings left no room for doubt. Next, several victims took the stand. A small business owner described how Hank had demanded payments for safety and had caused harm when the money wasn't paid. A local driver told how he had been unfairly ticketed time and time again for minor offenses, all because Hank was trying to get money out of him. One by one, the victims spoke, their voices shaky but determined. They knew this was their chance to make sure Hank never had the power to hurt anyone again. But it wasn't just the victims who spoke. Alex took the stand as well, his voice calm as he explained how he had gathered evidence of Hank's corruption during his undercover investigation. He showed the recordings from the warehouse, where Hank had made his final threats. The jury listened intently, and Alex could feel their eyes on him, understanding the seriousness of the case. Hank's defense lawyer tried to fight back, arguing that the evidence was incomplete and that Hank had been misunderstood. They claimed that Hank had always acted with good intentions, trying to protect the town in his own way. But the jury wasn't buying it. The facts spoke for themselves. Hank's actions were intentional, and his abuse of power had caused real harm to the people in the community. As the trial went on, it became clear that the evidence was overwhelming. Hank's once strong confidence began to waver. He could no longer hide behind his badge or his years of experience. The people he had bullied and threatened were standing up for themselves, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The defense's arguments grew weaker, and the judge seemed increasingly frustrated with their attempts to deflect the truth. Alex watched as Hank's face grew darker, realizing that his world was crumbling. For so long, he had believed he could get away with anything. But now, the reality was sinking in. The truth was out, and it was too late to change it. Finally, it was time for closing statements. The prosecutor spoke passionately, reminding the jury of the harm Hank had caused and the lives he had ruined. The defense tried one last time to cast doubt on the evidence, but it was clear to everyone in the room that Hank had been caught. There was no escaping the truth. As the jury filed out to deliberate, Alex could feel the weight of the moment. It wasn't over yet, but he knew the case had been made. Hank's time of power and control was coming to an end, and justice was finally within reach. The courtroom was filled with anticipation as the jury returned. Alex Ramirez sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the moment that would determine Hank Connor's fate. It had been a long road to get here, weeks of planning, months of investigation, and countless hours of work. Now, it was up to the judge and the jury to decide whether justice would be served. The judge entered the room, and the murmurs from the crowd quickly faded. He looked down at the papers in front of him, adjusting his glasses as he prepared to deliver his decision. Hank Connors, once a man of authority and power in the small town, now sat in the defendant's chair, his face pale and strained. His arrogance had been replaced with an air of nervousness, a far cry from the confidence he once carried like armor. The prosecutor stood, giving a final statement. Hank Connors abused his position for years. He manipulated, threatened, and extorted money from innocent people who were too scared to speak out. The evidence against him is undeniable. He has caused real harm to this community, and it is time for him to face the consequences of his actions. Alex listened closely, the words ringing in his ears. The prosecutor was right. Hank had used his badge and his authority to control the lives of the people in this town. And now, it was time for him to pay the price. The defense lawyer stood next, offering a weak argument. He claimed that Hank had made mistakes but didn't deserve to be punished so severely. He was only trying to do what he thought was best for the town. Yes, he made poor decisions, but he should not be thrown into prison for them. The courtroom was silent as Hank's lawyer finished speaking. It was hard to ignore the weight of the evidence against Hank. The victims had spoken. The recordings were clear. There was no denying what Hank had done. The defense's arguments fell flat, and the jury didn't seem convinced. The judge finally spoke, his voice steady and firm. Hank Connors, you are hereby sentenced to 8 years in prison for the crimes of extortion, abuse of power, and corruption. Your actions have hurt many people, and the damage you caused cannot be undone. The people of this town trusted you, and you betrayed that trust. The words hit Hank like a punch to the gut. He stared at the judge, his face pale and his mouth dry. It was over. There was no escape from the consequences of his actions. The years of power, the fear he had instilled in others, none of it mattered now. He was going to prison. As the gavel fell, marking the official end of the trial, Alex let out a quiet breath. It was over. The justice that had seemed so far away was now within reach. The town, which had been living under the shadow of Hank's control, could finally start to heal. Tom, one of Hank's victims, sat in the gallery, his face a mixture of relief and disbelief. For so long he had lived in fear, but now he could breathe a little easier knowing Hank would no longer be able to hurt him or anyone else. The courtroom began to clear, and Alex stayed for a moment longer, taking in the reality of what had just happened. Justice had been served, and Hank's reign of fear was over. As he walked out of the courthouse, Alex felt a sense of pride. It wasn't just about bringing Hank to justice. It was about standing up for the truth and making sure that no one else would ever have to suffer at the hands of someone like Hank again. The town had won, and so had the people who had fought for what was right. The town was quiet in the days after Hank Connors was sentenced. The streets, once tense with fear and distrust, now seemed a little brighter. People walked with a little more confidence, their heads held higher. The weight of Hank's abuse of power had been lifted, and the community was starting to heal. For Alex Ramirez, the work wasn't done yet. The trial had been a victory, but the real work was just beginning. He had exposed Hank for the corrupt officer he truly was, but Alex knew that a lot of damage had been done during the years Hank had ruled over the town. The scars left by his actions weren't just going to disappear overnight. But even as Alex thought about the long road ahead, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had done his job, and the people who had suffered under Hank's control now had a chance to live without fear. That was what mattered most. Tom, one of the men who had bravely testified against Hank, was doing his best to move on. The fear that had once gripped him was slowly fading. "I never thought I'd see the day when that man was behind bars," Tom said to Alex one afternoon as they sat in a quiet cafe. "It's like a weight has been lifted from my chest. I can finally breathe again." Alex smiled, glad to see the change in Tom. "You did the right thing, Tom. You helped put an end to the fear." Tom nodded, but there was still a look of sadness in his eyes. "I just can't believe it took so long. How many people had to suffer because no one stood up?" "That's the thing about corruption," Alex replied. "It thrives when people are too scared to speak out. But when they do, that's when change happens." The town had already begun to move forward, but Alex knew that Hank's actions had left a lasting mark. People would have to rebuild trust in their law enforcement, in their government, and in each other. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. As Alex had learned, it only took a few brave individuals to stand up and make a difference. In the weeks that followed, Alex worked closely with the local authorities to help rebuild the system that Hank had corrupted. He helped train officers in ethical conduct, ensuring that they understood the importance of their role in the community. He also met with local leaders, working to create a plan to prevent similar situations from happening in the future. Alex didn't stay in the town for long after the trial. His job was done, and there were other places in need of his help. But as he left, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The people here had faced a difficult battle, but they had won. They had taken back control of their town, and they had done it the right way, with courage, integrity, and determination. As Alex drove away, he looked in the rearview mirror and saw the town fading into the distance. He knew that this small victory was just one step in the ongoing fight for justice, but it was a step worth taking. And for the people in this town, it would mean a better future, a future free from fear and filled with hope.